Greetings, everyone, and welcome to my podcast, A Psychologist Looks at Scripture. My name is Peter Doherty. I'm a Catholic priest and a psychologist who integrates my training in psychology and scripture studies to help understand the Gospels from a different perspective and focus on new pastoral teachings for Christians. The Gospels are a rich source of learning, and we are far from exhausting the learning potential. My podcasts are between 7 to 10 minutes in length, where I share insights and reflections that I hope will be useful to you. Please don't hesitate to contact me with questions or comments. Love to hear from you. Today's podcast is from Mark chapter 10, verse 2 to 16. This gospel will be read in churches October the 6th, 2024. Today's podcast focuses on a question posed to Jesus by the Pharisees. Mark doesn't mince words. According to Mark, the Pharisees are testing Jesus, probably with ill intent. In fairness to the Pharisees, they often would gather at the temple to discuss a question from the Torah, where they would share different points of view. There are many examples where the Pharisees did try to trick Jesus. For example, in Matthew chapter 22, verse 17, the Pharisees asked Jesus, "Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not?" They are trying to create a dilemma for Jesus. If Jesus says, yes, pay taxes, then Jesus would alienate himself from the people who hated the Romans who had conquered them. If Jesus said, no, don't pay taxes to Caesar, then he would be labeled a political agitator and likely would have been arrested, probably on the spot. Either way, the Pharisees would win. In this instance, Jesus responds by asking for a coin used for the tax and inquires whose image is on it. When they reply that it is Caesar's, Jesus famously states, "Therefore, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God." Jesus wins again. Returning to the Gospel, the tradition of the Pharisees debating Scripture is actually an adult model of learning, so much better than the lecture model that is so prevalent in many of our higher places of learning. Jesus doesn't dismiss the teachings of Moses, but goes back to basics and quotes from the very first book of the Bible, the book of Genesis. We don't know how the Pharisees responded to this new teaching on marriage. However, Jesus describes marriage as going beyond the married couple and makes it clear that one cannot simply write a note of divorce to end the marriage. You may have noticed that the law is very one-sided. The man can divorce his wife, but the wife is not mentioned in the law. Divorce is hard on everyone. It speaks to the end of certain dreams and hopes. People can be angry, hurt, disappointed, and disillusioned. I could go on. Jesus speaks about the permanency of marriage. Many Christian denominations have interpreted this scripture differently, but I want to draw your attention to the comment Jesus made, and I quote, "What God has joined together, no human being must separate." This is a very important line. We assume that when someone has a wedding in a church, witnessed before a priest or a minister, that they are married. That is a reasonable assumption, but I wonder if it's true in every case. I personally have officiated at many weddings in my almost 40 years of priesthood. I have met many well-meaning couples that did not fully understand what they were doing. I suspect it was years later that many couples grew to truly understand their marriage vows, and therefore make them valid. I don't believe that it is all unusual. Many individuals come to fully understand their life's work and commitments only after they have made their wedding commitment. How many of my listeners still understand their marriage today in the same way they did on their wedding day? Speaking for myself, I must say that my own understanding of priesthood has radically changed over the last 40 years. Sadly, some couples do not grow in their marriage to reach that point that God has unified them as a couple. I don't believe that God calls us to stay in a marriage that has become toxic, soul-burning, or dysfunctional. While I'm totally committed to helping marriages be successful and happy, I realize that some unions were never meant to be. I've heard the term, love is a choice. I'm not sure everyone agrees with that. Some people may be more comfortable with the expression falling in love. While I agree that people can be drawn into loving someone, there is still, nevertheless, in my opinion, some aspect of choice. I once had a colleague who remarked to me many years ago that he had been married 8 times. I was shocked by the number of times he was married, and the irony of the situation was that he was a marriage counselor. Fortunately, he went on to say that there were 7 times in his marriage where he felt it had ended, but that he and his wife had made the choice to keep work at reconnecting. I used to ask couples, when I was working in pre-marriage courses, ask couples who were contemplating marriage what made them feel their marriage was going to last. Invariably, I was told that they loved each other. And I like to respond by saying, I think you misunderstood me. My question is, what makes you think your marriage is going to last? The point that I'm trying to drive home is that love makes a marriage happy, but it doesn't guarantee the success of the union. The couple needs other skills. Obviously, for example, communication skills, shared interests and values, and mutual respect are needed for a marriage to grow. I have a friend of mine who has been married before, and she describes her divorce of her first marriage as a failure. I challenged her to see that her first marriage is not a failure if she learned something from it and is now better prepared for the next marriage. I think I made a point, as their second marriage has lasted over 30 years. I've made it clear to couples that they could be married in a basilica. Their officiant could be a bishop. But if their consent is not there or something missing, they're not married before God. Consent can be impacted by family pressure to get married, a lack of maturity or understanding as to what they're consenting to. As I've previously mentioned, people have to grow in their ability to give their consent. You've probably heard the African proverb, made famous by Hillary Clinton, "It takes a village to raise a child," found in her book, It Takes a Village and Other Lessons Children Teach Us, published in 1996. I've come to the conclusion that it takes a village to create a happy and successful marriage. Couples need the support of their family and friends to have a successful marriage. The second part of this gospel speaks on the relationship Jesus had with children. According to Jesus, children are certainly meant to be seen and heard. There are 2 other examples of Jesus showing his care and pointing out that children have an important lesson for adults. These are Matthew chapter 18, verse 2-5, and Mark chapter 9, verse 36-37. These readings speak of inclusivity. Jesus actively invites children into his presence, indicating they hold a special place in his heart. The readings speak of humility and trust, and Jesus teaches that entering the kingdom of heaven requires a childlike humility and trust. And finally, the readings speak of protection and blessing. Jesus emphasizes the importance of protecting children and blessing them, showing his deep concern for their well-being. Today's gospel speaks about family issues and values. Families play an important part in our spiritual and faith development. Jesus teaches us that marriage is more than just a contract between a couple, but a blessed union, something much bigger than ourselves. Thank you for listening. I invite you to join me next week when I examine the Gospel of Mark, who describes Jesus inviting his listeners to go beyond the 10 Commandments written on stone tablets to writing the 10 Commandments in their hearts. If this is the first time you've heard my podcast and you're interested in hearing more, I urge you to listen to my podcasts listed on the website. Every Sunday, I release a new podcast focusing on the gospel for the following week. I invite you to listen to all the podcasts, and I hope the reflections are useful to you. The podcast, A Psychologist Looks at Scripture, is found on most of the platforms that carry podcasts. The podcast is also available on YouTube. Please do not hesitate to leave a review or even subscribe. Feedback from my listeners can be helpful in the development of the podcast. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank my team, Heather Patel-Doherty and Ritu Coulomb, who play an important part in the preparation of this podcast. If you have any questions or concerns, I can be reached by email at peter.doherty, O-M-I, that is DOHERTYOMI, @gmail.com. God bless you and have a great week.